Ladies and gentlemen of the Action Army, what is going on? And welcome to another episode of Answers for Athletes. In today's video, we have a question from, I cannot even begin to try to pronounce your name, so we're going to call you Anik, A-N-E-K. Anik says, hey coach, I want to try French contrast training. How much rest would you suggest between exercises in a giant set when switching from one exercise to another? How many times per week would you recommend doing giant sets? And what's the best way to manage the load when moving to power or peaking phases? That's a lot of questions. I got a lot of answers for you, but before I give you these answers, make sure that you comment JUMP, J-U-M-P, down below in the comment section if you want a free bodyweight vertical jump training program. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your question down below if you want me to answer your question in a video just like this. So just in case you want your answer and then you don't want to hear me yap about the rest of the things that I have to say, the answer is to your first question, how much rest would you suggest between exercises in a giant set when switching from one exercise to another? 15 to 20 seconds in between exercises via Cal Dietz's recommendation. So let me just very quickly read a blurb from this book, Triphasic Training, about French contrast and what the French contrast method is, just in case anybody out there doesn't know what it is or needs a little recap. So, at its simplest level, the French contrast method is the combination of the complex and contrast methods outlined above. It consists of 4 different exercises: a heavy compound exercise, 80 to 90% 1 rep max, a plyometric jump, a drop set or a weighted jump, 30% 1 rep max, and a plyometric or accelerated plyometric. While on the surface, this may appear to simply be the joining of the complex and contrast methods, the physiological and neural adaptation it stimulates makes it a far superior method for training sport performance, especially those that require high rates of force production. So, I have so much that I could say about French contrast, except I think I'm going to try to not yap, and I'm going to stick to the questions here that you asked me because I have a lot to say. So to answer your first question, which I already did, 15 to 20 seconds in between exercises if you want to perform French contrast the way that French contrast was meant to be performed. So when you look up Cal Dietz on his YouTube, he has examples of French contrast training. They're pretty old. They're like 10 plus years old at this point. So he could have 100% changed his views on a lot of things. A lot of coaches, they are constantly learning. So what he recommends or recommended in the version of this book that I have, or what he has on his YouTube, might be slightly outdated, but I'll give you my opinions for sure. So 15 to 20 seconds in between exercises is going to be great. Now, I do want to point out that if you are only taking 15 seconds in between exercises, and the goal of French contrast training is potentiation, right? So post-activation potentiation, the goal is to do this heavy compound lift that's then going to excite your nervous system, and then you go and you do your plyometric, then you do your loaded jump, then you do your accelerated plyo. There's 2 different ways that I think, or 2 different rest periods that I think you could take in between exercises for French contrast. So when I program contrast training in my programs, so let's say we do a back squat, and then after that, we're going to do some depth jumps or some box jumps or seated box jumps or whatever. I like the athlete to take 30 to 60 seconds in between those exercises. Why? If we just go and we do our back squats and then immediately walk over to the box, there's a chance that we could be slightly fatigued from those squats before doing our box jumps or whatever plyometric we have, and then that defeats the purpose. If the purpose is potentiation and that your nervous system is excited, therefore you can get higher power outputs on that plyometric exercise, then we have to be careful when only taking 15 to 20 seconds in between the exercises for the French contrast method. So let me read just something very quickly, and I'll sum up where I was going with this. So Cal Dietz in his book says, once the plyometric jump is completed, the athlete goes directly to the weighted jump. This is where I believe the athlete switches over from training power development to training explosive work capacity. the ability to produce power in a somewhat fatigued state. So you have to ask yourself, is my goal to be able to produce power in a fatigued state, or is my goal to jump as high as possible? So for a lot of sport athletes, basketball players, football players, their goal might be to be able to produce a lot of power in a fatigued state, which is where I think that the 15 to 20 second rest periods really can come into play and help you do that. But if the goal is pure power production, then we would probably get more of a stimulus on the organism if we split those 4 exercises up and did not do them back to back to back to back with 15 to 20 seconds in between. Because if we do a heavy squat, rest 15 seconds, go do a depth jump or a couple reps of a depth jump. So let's say we do 3 reps of squats, rest 15 seconds, 3 reps of depth jumps, rest 15 seconds. Then we do 3 to 5 reps of dumbbell squat jumps, rest 15 seconds, and then do 5 to 8 reps of band accelerated plyometrics, holding a band and doing your plyos that way. The overspeed exercise, which is very controversial at this point. If we do all those with 15 seconds, sure, like we're gonna be really training the body to produce high power in fatigue states. But do we want to do that? Do you want to do that? Because like the whole goal, like a big point of vertical jump training in power training is for every rep to be as explosive as possible. So if we're only resting 15 seconds in between those, wouldn't we get more out of our depth jump if we weren't fatigued from the back squat? If we weren't, wouldn't we get more out of the dumbbell squat jumps if we weren't fatigued from the squats and the depth jumps? So you have to really be careful that you're not overly fatigued for these giant sets. It is very, very important. In my opinion, if you're, like I keep saying, if your goal is to be able to produce a lot of power when you're fatigued, go for it. But if your goal is maximum power output or jumping as high as possible, then you have to do one of 2 things. Number one, you have to take longer rest in between those 4 different exercises. 30 to 60 seconds is what I believe is probably best. Actually, 3 things. Number 2, just break them up and don't do them as a French contrast method. And then number 3, you have to really make sure that you are not fatiguing yourself so much with each one of these separate components of the French contrast method. So when you do your 80 to 90% heavy compound movement, you have to make sure that you're leaving a rep or 2 in the tank. So you might only do 2 reps. If it's 80%, you might only do 2 to 3 reps of that squat. And then you're not going to go to failure. You're going to avoid high fatigue on that squat. So you're not going to failure, because if you go to failure on that squat or really close to failure, then you go to do your depth jump 15 seconds later, the power outputs from that depth jump, the adaptations from that depth jump are going to be so much lower than if you just did that depth jump by itself. Okay, these are all just my opinions. Who am I? I'm a fucking bonehead. What do I know? I don't know. This is just what I think, I guess. But to me, it just makes sense, like when you think about it. Next question. Hopefully I answered that question. So 15 to 20 seconds per Cal Dietz. I am definitely not smarter than Cal Dietz. I'm just saying, what is the goal? Is the goal power production when you're fatigued, or is the goal to jump as high as possible and dunk on everybody? Next one. How many times per week would you recommend doing giant sets? 1 to 2 and no more. 1 is likely good. It depends. So let's say, in my Be on the Rim 3 program, we go through a max strength phase and we do it 2 times per week. And you actually a lot of athletes don't even need periodization. You don't need to go strength phase, then power phase, then peaking phase. Some athletes, if you're not actively in a career of playing sports, then you can probably get more results from having phases to your programming. But if you're actively playing sports and you play your sport all the time, In your off season, you're still crushing yourself. Like you still have, like for my high school basketball athletes, our off season, they are still playing so much basketball, like skill workouts every day, like 3 to 5 AAU games on the weekends. Like it's still a lot. So periodization can be beneficial, but it's not always needed. It is a little bit overrated. Still use it for some athletes. I don't use it for other athletes. So you have to, I'll do a different video on that, I guess. But where am I at? What the hell was I yapping about? How many times per week? 1 to 2. So in Beyond the Rim 3, we do it 2 times per week because it's a max strength phase. So how many days a week are you going to lift heavy? Answer that. How many days a week do you plan on lifting really heavy? For most athletes, it might be once a week. For a lot of athletes, it might be once every other week. So if you're going to do French contrast training, I would do your French contrast training on that day that you are going to lift heavy, because that the first component of French contrast is that 80 to 90% heavy compound lift. So I would just ask yourself, how many days a week do I want to lift heavy? And then do French contrast training when you're going to lift heavy. And then the last question, what's the best way to manage the load when moving to power or peaking phases? Not exactly sure what you mean by that. What is the best way to manage the load when moving to power or peaking phases? So I think when you move to a power or a peaking phase, you have 2 options. Option number 1, you have to ask yourself, am I going to touch on these parameters that I was improving during the strength phase? So in the strength phase, we're lifting heavy a lot. When you get to a power phase, you're not going to lift as heavy overall, right? The goal is power. If we look at the force velocity curve, power right in the middle. So percentages are going to be, I can't even remember, 30 to 80% 1 rep max. But it's not going to be as heavy. You have to ask yourself, am I going to still touch on strength work? Am I still going to go heavy every once in a while? So if you are still going to go heavy every once in a while, then manage the load. I still don't know what you mean by that, but you would add your French contrast on that heavy day in that power phase if you are going to do French contrast. And then same thing with the peaking phase. If you still are going to lift heavy here and there in your peaking phase, then just do French contrast on that day that you lift heavy, because we have that first movement is the 80 to 90% 1 rep max. That's the first option, okay? The second option is just to not do French contrast at all in these power and peaking phases. So in my quote unquote peaking phase, my back off phase, the phase where it's way lower volume and everything is super high intensity, do I still lift heavy? Yes, with my athletes. We still lift heavy, likely once a week. Like we're still lifting heavy. And it'll just be like 5 sets of 2 or 5 sets of 3. So if I were to do French contrast training, it would be on that day where I do 5 sets of 2, 5 sets of 3. So it is definitely possible in your power and peaking phases. In your peaking phases, it should be, one of the main goals should be way lower volume. Like one great way to peak your vert, to be jumping your highest, is to not be crushing your central nervous system with a ton of volume. And then another thing that you're going to do is obviously it's going to be more elastic-based exercises, more velocity-focused exercises, reactive strength, et cetera, et cetera. So I have no clue whether I answered all your questions or not. I think I answered your first 2. I'm just not sure what you meant by the last one. What's the best way to manage the load when you move into a power or peaking phase? But hopefully you got something out of this video. If you did like this video, subscribe to the channel. Comment jump for that free bodyweight vertical jump training program. And leave your question down below if you want me to answer your question in a video just like this. And Get Beyond the Rim 2, it has triphasic training. Get Beyond the Rim 3, it has French contrast training added into it. Or get my vertical jump secret system, which has the secrets, everything that you need to get some crazy, crazy bounce. I guarantee 6 to 12 inches on your vertical or your money back. But keep in mind, it's a 2-year-long program. So it's not for the soft asses out there or the weak at heart. And that's why I guarantee 6 to 12. If I can't get you 6 inches, bro, in 2 years, then I suck as a coach. But I will get you that and probably much more. Anyways, I'm here yapping. So I'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Peace.